Greetings, fellow travelers. Welcome to the 28th level of the RPG Cave. I'm one of your hosts, the level 99 human archmage, Ryan Turford, and I'm joined, as always, by the level 99 elf ranger, Mr. Garret Bland. Garret, how are you doing on this lovely, very snowy Sunday afternoon?
I'm doing great. It's not that snowy over here. We may have gotten like a little bit of like a blanket of the tiniest snowflakes, and that I freak out every time I see snow because I'm a born Texan. So
right.
Yeah, I was excited for it. But how about over there? How's it over there?
I mean, it's Canada. There's tons of snow.
It is Canada.
And I definitely know that feeling, Garret, because like I lived in Houston for 3 years, and I remember like the one day it snowed out of the 3 years I was there, and it was like the whole like city shut down, and like people were freaking out with like a centimeter of snow. It was the craziest thing in the world. I can't believe that, but. Yeah.
That's Texas for you. It's insane.
Exactly. So I totally get that. And before we clean the dungeon, Garret, we actually got a comment from not the last week's show, which was the Advance Wars episode, but the episode before that, the Pokemon episode, where someone had commented that you had not mentioned you were drinking your second cup of coffee. And I noticed we're this far into the show, and you also haven't mentioned a second cup of coffee yet. Garret, what's the coffee situation looking like? I know you're trying to stay awake, but what's going on there?
So I've already drank my second cup, and I need to be in moderation. I can't go with a third cup for the show, or else I'll get the jitters. Yeah. Normally what I do now is 2 cups of coffee and then a cup of tea at night, and it's like you're good. You don't need any more caffeine in your body. You got to make sure we're okay here. So that's why I did not mention my second cup of coffee.
So clearly you're not going the same route as Fry from Futurama, where he had his like unlimited coffee card. So he drank like 12 cups of coffee in like 2 hours, and he was like jittering. What a great episode.
That would be dangerous.
Futurama is a great show, folks. All right, let's clear the dungeon of some pesky mobs before we start the show. Of course, if you like what we do and you want to support the show, there's a number of ways to do that. Number one, you can check us out on your podcast feed of choice, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify. We're on all the places where you find podcasts, so check us out there, subscribe to us there. Also, if you leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, we'll read it right here on the show. Also, if you want to see our beautiful faces every single week, head on over to YouTube, youtube.com/YumiCapri is how you do that. We put up a video version of the show every single Saturday morning, so you can check us out there. Also, if you want the show a little bit early, head over to Patreon, patreon.com/YumiCapri is how you do that. You get early access to all of our shows, as well as some exclusive content, so head on over there. All right, Garret, it's time to read from the sacred texts, because it's time to talk about one of my all-time favorite RPG game series, and I'm so excited to talk about it with you, especially because like it's not very often I get to talk to someone who's like new to Mass Effect very often.
Yes, very new.
Versus someone like me who's like super ingrained in it, or when I talk about it with Sean, like him and I are both kind of over the moon with Mass Effect. So I'm so glad we're talking about Mass Effect today, so I can kind of give you some of my knowledge from being a big Mass Effect fan for years, but then also hear kind of what someone who's kind of new to the games has to think about it. So before we get into things, normally we would have a huge fun fact section where I would go into a bunch of stuff, but I actually wanted to keep it a little bit slim this week because we got a lot of questions about Mass Effect this week, Garret. So I just want to throw out there, of course, the first Mass Effect came out on November 10th, 2007. It was the game that made me buy my Xbox 360, or at least convinced me to do
that's so cool.
Because I was actually a huge BioWare fan from the original Xbox days, because they had done Knights of the Old Republic and Jade Empire, and I loved both those games. And essentially, at the time, BioWare had 2 different teams, which is why like Jade Empire came out like a year after KOTOR did. And the team that did Knights of the Old Republic ended up doing Mass Effect. So when I heard that that the team that did KOTOR is doing a game that was part of like what was supposed to be like this planned trilogy, kind of like the Lord of the Rings movies were, like I was like super excited about that idea, and it was
a dream come true.
Exactly. And it was actually exclusive to Xbox 360 at the time, because it was actually published by Microsoft. So Microsoft Game Studios actually published the first game, because they actually had published both Knights of the Republic and Jade Empire in the same way, because that was before BioWare was actually owned by EA at that point. So they were still an independent studio at the time. So they would always usually be looking for like a specific publisher, and Xbox swooped in there and got them on the Xbox. Otherwise, before that, they were just a PC studio before that, or working on Dreamcast games, because they also, BioWare did MDK2 on the Dreamcast and Baldur's Gate games on the PC as well. So they were like, this was kind of like the coming out party for BioWare itself. And of course, there's 3 mainline Mass Effect games, and then there was a 4th game called Mass Effect Andromeda, which we'll talk about on the show. But for the most part, I kind of wanted our discussion to be kind of about the 3 games, especially because Garret, this kind of also fills in how I got into Mass Effect, because I was like day one ready to buy Mass Effect. I was so excited for it. But what about you? What's your story with Mass Effect?
I think I've told this numerous times, like in previous podcasts before, in Nintendo Shack, and probably in a Yumi and Capri podcast as well. But Mass Effect is a gaping hole in my video game repertoire, and it's sad because I think I would really, really like these games. I think I missed BioWare for some reason. When I had my Xbox 360, I really played a lot of more like Call of Duty, like first-person shooters at the time in middle school and high school. And then I played other little things like BioShock and Assassin's Creed, but I didn't really know what like an RPG really was until I like the genre itself, Western RPG, until Skyrim. Yeah. So I completely missed the boat with Mass Effect, and I seen Mass Effect over the years now and realize how high praise it is among the RPG fans. And so I actually got Mass Effect 1, I think, and 2 via backwards compatibility on Xbox. I think I actually bought hard copies from a GameStop for like $2. Nice. For each of them. And I played for like, I think 6 or 7 hours on the first Mass Effect. At the time, I kind of dropped it because there's just, I think at the time I was really busy with work, and then I had like 5 other games I was playing. I wasn't really organized with my backlog. So I kind of stopped with that. And then I've recently gotten the Mass Effect Legendary Edition. I actually got it on sale for a very good price because I also had Microsoft reward points. And so it was digital sale, reward points. I got it for like $10. Nice. So I am starting the first game right now. I'm glad I waited until this collection. It is very beautiful. And I'm starting with the first Mass Effect game. I'm really getting into it. Yeah, and I think I do see that formula now because I actually played Dragon Age Origins like a couple years back. And I'm like, okay, this is kind of the same BioWare character relationship RPG element formula that I really enjoy. I really do enjoy these type of games. So hopefully throughout next year, I'll finish all 3 of them. And yeah, I'm ready to get into it, man. Nice.
I mean, yeah, you're definitely in for a treat, and yeah, you can't really beat that price. Like that's pretty dang cheap. I will say also, for those that also haven't jumped into these games and you don't want to pay for the Legendary Edition, like maybe you don't want to spend all that money, these games are also available on Game Pass Ultimate if you actually have Game Pass Ultimate, because they're in the vault for EA Play because they're backwards compatible games as well. So you do have that option available to you as a way to play these games if for whatever reason you don't want to actually pony up the money for the Legendary Edition. But this kind of brings us into kind of maybe where to start with Mass Effect, because actually the Legendary Edition is the way I would say to start with these games. Yes. Especially with all the improvements to 1 in particular, because 1 is a game that I really liked when it came out, but it's a game that hasn't really aged super well as far as the way the visual design kind of works in that game. So I'm glad that they were able to touch that up a lot with the new version of the game. It was an Unreal 3 game at the time. And I actually think it looked pretty good when it first came out, but then just, over the years, it's like not aged super well, at least from like the character models or some of the environments haven't really aged super well. But again, the Legendary Edition kind of curbs all that. Plus, you got all the improvements to the Mako, which is the ground vehicle that you get later in the game, which controls terribly in the original version. It's still not amazing in the new version, but at least it's better. At least it's a better experience than the original game. But yeah, so if you're definitely getting started with Mass Effect, start with those. For God's sakes, don't start with Mass Effect Andromeda, because it actually takes place after these games and it spoils the ending. So please don't do that, even though it's its own animal. But again, I'll talk about that a little bit later. So of course, with it being a BioWare game, the most important thing is the story. And the one thing I love about Mass Effect story is that it's basically this grand space opera that is essentially like one game that's basically split into 3 games. It kind of reminds me of, I don't think that I've talked about this series of games before, but the Dot Hack games from Bandai Namco back on the PlayStation 2, where essentially your one save carries with you from the first game all the way to the third game, and essentially you have your same character along the way, like your Commander Shepard, whether you choose male or female, and essentially along the way, all of your interactions with all the other characters, as well as your choices throughout the story, matter from start to finish. And some of even the little choices you may make, like early on in the game, really like come back to haunt you in like really interesting ways in like the third game. So I really love how they mess around with the choices and stuff like that, because they tried to do that in Dragon Age as well, but they didn't do it the same way. They kind of had this like online choice picker thing where you had to go to the Dragon Age website and then put your choices in from the last 2 games when Dragon Age Inquisition came out, and then it would just then import those choices into your save for Inquisition. But they did it in such a weird way that it just didn't feel the same as this. And plus, you didn't make nearly as many choices as you make in, Mass Effect 1, whereas you've probably noticed by now, Garrett, you make a lot of choices in this game.
I played 3 hours of this game, and I'm like, wow, there's a lot of things that have gone very differently, and I've gotten very different results. Yeah. But so far, I'm satisfied with my decisions. But I'm wondering how this is going to turn out throughout the first game. Yeah,
exactly. And just like Knights of the Old Republic or Jade Empire, you kind of have a meter that's kind of like a morality meter that is either Paragon for kind of the good side, and then Renegade for kind of the bad side. Although again, they're more like, they're closer to shades of gray than something as like stark contrasting to each other as like Sith versus Jedi in that way. So you're not like super evil if you play Renegade, for example, but you're more of just a big jerk if you're a Renegade.
I don't like being jerks. Even with like NPCs, I'm like, I don't want to be a jerk to you. Like that's not how I am.
Yeah, it's more like you're just mean and you're just like, get out of my way, versus Paragon, where you're like trying to help people and stuff like that. So
it sounds like Infamous.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like every time I make a bad choice, I feel guilty about it. I'm like, oh, I didn't want to do that, but very different outcomes though.
Yep. And that's how I can tell that you and I are kind of, great podcast hosts, because you're totally Paragon, Garrett, and I'm totally Renegade when I play Mass Effect.
Nice.
Or, when I play a lot of games, I usually actually play the evil side, because how many games do you really get to play where you're actually playing as kind of like almost like the bad guy or an anti-hero? Like it doesn't actually, I find that it's more refreshing to play that role. So that's why a lot of times if you're given the option to kind of make the bad choices, that's usually the side I kind of lean on, because maybe I'm just an evil person. Maybe that's just what the game is trying to tell me.
Deep down inside.
Yeah, maybe I just want to, punch some people in the face or something like that. That's just my thing.
Hey, first step to admittance.
Exactly. But the story itself just starts very small, where essentially you're on this routine mission to basically stop this invasion by these like evil androids who are basically attacking this human colonized planet. But then it turns into kind of this, like it grows and grows from there to become like a galaxy-wide struggle to eventually you'll get to a certain point in the game and you'll learn about kind of the bigger threat and stuff like that. But again, I'm not going to spoil anything. This is a very much a spoiler-free discussion to kind of set up the story here, especially because Garrett's never played it.
I'm just starting.
Yeah, and the story is one of the best things about Mass Effect. I mean, it's written the first game in particular is written by Drew Karpyshyn, who actually wrote Mass Effect 2 as well. And I mean, the writing in at least the first 2 games is incredible, off the charts good. One of the best written video games I think I've ever played. I really love the dialogue in this game, especially when it's not even from just the main characters in your party that are well written, but also when you talk to a lot of the NPCs, a lot of them feel like just real characters that exist in like this like real world that they could actually exist. So because you can definitely tell that that's because of good writing that I kind of feel that way about them. So I love the writing in the Mass Effect games, and especially the way your choices play into that, as well as because I can't even imagine like how large the script is for a game like this, like even just Mass Effect 1, because you have to script a web, because then you have to like script all the choices and then how they kind of play into each other and stuff too. But then one of the things I liked about the choices in this that this game did different versus a lot of other games is that it'll basically give you like one of 3 options, let's say, and each one of them will say one thing. But when you actually select that option, your character won't just regurgitate that same line. They'll actually say kind of a interpreted version or like a more drawn out version of basically what choice you made, essentially. So it just feels more cohesive in the dialogue anyways, versus a lot of other choice-based games where you read the choice yourself, you then select it, and then they read the choice again, and it just feels like almost verbatim. Like it's out of place. Whereas this, it just feels just so much more natural. Also, I love the fact too that, again, in a lot of these choice-based games, your character usually doesn't speak in a lot of these games, versus in this game, Commander Shepard is very, very vocal in this game.
All the time, yes.
Yeah, whether you're making the choices or not. So your character your character feels like you're part of the party itself, which again, just was so different from all these other games that were doing choices at this time, let alone today too, because I see a lot of choice-based games now that still come out and, it's still falling in some of these same traps. So I think Mass Effect was really unique with a lot of that stuff. So Garrett, before I kind of get into some of the spoilery stuff from the story, which we're going to separate them from, we got a couple questions from the community that I'm still going to actually ask you about before I get into my spoiler-ishy take, because I know you'll be able to actually answer them. Number 1, this comes to us from Mike at BlazeKnight0923. Did you go with male or female Shepard?
I initially went with male.
Okay.
I don't okay, so what would be the main differences? Would it just be romance options, or is there a preference in the games? I'm not quite sure there would be a big difference between male and female Shep.
So there is a difference as far as romance options. You're correct about that.
Okay.
And there are some dialogue changes. For example, early on, because I think you've probably made it to the Citadel already, right?
Yeah, I'm way into the Citadel now, yeah.
So when you go interact with the first CSEC officer as part of your investigation, he makes like this like very like condescending remark if you're a female Shepard versus if you're male Shepard, he's just like, yeah, what do you want? Kind of thing. So like you get little dialogue changes like that throughout the experience.
I remember that guy. The guy in the bar or whatever. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
So there are certain things like that are also woven into the story, depending on your gender. But for the most part, you're right. It's mostly just a choice between kind of genders, and also like which Shepard voice actor, for example, you kind of prefer, which plays a big part in it. Because online, there's quite the argument between the two. Although actually, most people actually kind of agree at this point, because Mark Meer plays male Shepard, and then Jennifer Hale plays female Shepard. And most people lean towards Jennifer Hale being the superior of the two, as far as her acting chops versus Mark Meer, essentially.
Well, yeah, he kind of sounds like and of course, very beginning stuff, but he kind of sounds like a robot.
Yeah, like, he's more. I think of him as more like generic protagonist, anyways. Whereas
very generic.
Whereas like Jennifer Hale like really gets into it, and like she actually does an amazing job as Shepard. So I actually think female Shepard's definitely my choice, but it has to ask. So you're playing as male Shepard then, right? Confirmed?
Yes.
Okay.
Male Shepard.
Cool. And then we already answered Mike's question about Paragon or Renegade. Again, I'm assuming you're going for the most part Paragon.
I don't know if they introduced that system yet. Maybe I skipped it, but I'm making the choices that are not like attacking people or it's more or like being a jerk in general. I'm more of the thoughtful, hesitant type of choices.
Yeah, you'll see like more of the like extreme sides of those choices later on in the game. But you do see a little bit of it because you'll on the right-hand side of your screen, whenever you make a choice that affects Paragon or Renegade, it'll say Paragon +2 or Renegade +5 or something like that. And likewise, there's actually a bar in your main menu when you go to just your character screen on the right-hand side that'll just show where your character's at with that, because that also affects other things in the game, such as the way NPCs actually interact with Shepard. If you're more of a jerk or less of a jerk, like characters will treat you differently, or it also affects your appearance as well. Like Shepard, the Shepard's looks a little bit different, for example, if you go towards full Renegade or full Paragon. So
interesting.
Yeah. So that plays into that a little bit as well. But again, there's a whole bunch of spoilery questions. So we're going to cut it off right now. Future Ryan's going to tell you, answer all these spoiler effort questions from the community. And again, huge thank you to everyone who submitted questions this week, because the community totally came out with this. Like, you definitely tell people love Mass Effect because of the questions.
Yes.
So let's go to Future Ryan right now, and we'll be right back. Hey friends, Future Ryan here. Of course, time to go through some of these spoilery kind of questions here, because again, Garret didn't want to hear any spoilers. So let's start out with the Pirate of Tsushima at the Ice Pirate, who asked the question, why was that the ending that BioWare picked to finish the trilogy with? So again, I'm assuming the Ice Pirate is actually referring to the end of Mass Effect 3, where, things happen. You basically get, one of 3 color-coded choices, and then Bob's your uncle at that point, regardless of what kind of your choices are. Although there is some deviation there, of course, because depending on obviously your war resources, different things will happen with the destruction ending or not, or certain choices will be available or not available to you. For example, the green choice, which is the choice where, the synthetics and the humans basically all blend into one race, essentially. That's only available to you under certain circumstances. It's not always available to you, but you're always usually at least given 2 choices. That's usually how that works. And if you kind of believe kind of like the color coding of it, like it's almost like the Paragon choice is to basically, sacrifice yourself to take over the Reapers essentially and to control them. And then everyone just goes on their merry way at that point, versus, the destruction ending where, all the mass relays blow up and all the ships blow up and you basically lose all of the mechanical technology in a lot of ways. But so there's no real optimal choice, but I don't know. I have an interesting story to tell about this, because I was someone who actually played Mass Effect 3 early, in fact, earlier than actually other people had access to it. And it wasn't because I was reviewing the game or anything like that, but my local Walmart that was in my area was actually selling the game like a week and a half early. Like they would do that all the time with BioWare games for whatever reason. Like I actually have the same story with Mass Effect 2 and Dragon Age Origins, where I would go to the same Walmart every time I know there was a BioWare game coming out. And lo and behold, they would actually always have the game, on shelves 2 weeks before it actually came out. So I'd actually finished the game long before even the game actually released. In fact, it only took me a couple days really to finish it. And I didn't actually know that there was any going to be any kind of hubbub around the ending. So when I played the game for the first time and I got to the ending, I mean, obviously this was before we really had comparison videos to kind of show, all the endings were kind of, similar to each other. Like I didn't know that going into it. So when making my choice at the end, I made my choice. I was like, oh, that's a cool ending. Even though it's weird that Neil Armstrong is talking to this child and, there's this, all the mass relays blew up and stuff like that. But you know what? It was an ending that felt like it kind of coalesced with kind of the choice that I made at the end, combined with the fact that ultimately I think that the real ending to Mass Effect 3 is not necessarily like the final assault with the elusive man and then the choice, but I feel like the real ending to Mass Effect 3 is like when you're saying goodbye to all your party members, because right before you go to kind of the final battle, essentially, as you will, you basically can go to the area to basically talk to each of your crew members, whether they're on Earth or not at that point, and then you kind of have your own personal conversation that then is almost like your ending to that story, especially like all of those kind of combined together and like one kind of vignette is like how I imagine the game kind of ending, and kind of is almost like the game's true ending to someone like me. So I personally didn't hate the ending as much. Obviously, yes, I would have loved, more deviation between the three endings. I do like that they went back and did the extended cut to kind of talk about more as to like what happens with the rest of the universe, obviously after that choice, because for the most part, it kind of just ended with the original ending. So I do appreciate that being there. But at the same time, I love a lot of things just being kind of left up to your own interpretation as well. Like I don't need every game, to be over explaining things. So I actually didn't mind the ending in Mass Effect 3 as much as a lot of other people do. Sure, it definitely has some problems, but I actually didn't mind the ending as much. So especially again to the point of my story where like I played it in a vacuum and honestly didn't even think there was a problem with it, let alone that there would even be people complaining about it. So yeah, I don't know. I think it's totally fine, but let's move on. Seumas MacIsaac at Famous Seumas asks a whole bunch of questions here. Let's start with favorite side missions, favorite characters, favorite random thing that carried over throughout the trilogy. So as far as the favorite random thing that carried out over the whole trilogy was actually something I was not expecting to actually carry on past the first game. And that was actually my interactions with Conrad Werner, who's actually like Commander Shepard's biggest fan on the Citadel, where you essentially meet him as you kind of walk up the stairs in the wards essentially. And he basically just starts talking to you. He's like fanboying out essentially. And regardless of, whether you're nice to him or not nice to him, it kind of ends in the same way where he's kind of like upset with Shepard, but usually for different reasons. Either you're just a jerk to him or you tell him, hey, don't go join the military because you're probably going to die kind of thing. So I actually liked the fact that he actually returned in Mass Effect 2 and Mass Effect 3 as long as you continue to talk to him, which I thought was like super interesting and cool. So I was not expecting that. And again, he's just such a goofy character that I loved kind of seeing, Conrad Werner along the way throughout my entire journey through the world of Mass Effect. As far as like a favorite side mission, there isn't one in particular that I'm like super in love with. The one from Mass Effect 1 that I still always will remember was actually there's this base on the moon that actually gets taken over by evil AI robots, and you basically have to go there and take it out. I remember really enjoying that one because you actually, first of all, that was the first time we actually saw Earth in Mass Effect 1. It was actually when you got to that mission. It was like really late on in the game too. And then I loved just driving around the moon. Like that was one of my favorite things to do, was just because you don't really, how often do you get to, drive around, our moon in a game? So I thought it was really cool and refreshing. So that's what I liked about that side mission. But other than that, like, yeah, and here's the thing. I don't really consider like the loyalty missions in Mass Effect 2 kind of side missions because you kind of have to do them in order to finish the game. Yes, you definitely can do it, but obviously, disastrous things result in the suicide mission. But if I could include those, I would say Jacob's mission, loyalty mission, which is one that I was not expecting to enjoy as much as I did because I wasn't really like super invested in like Jacob as a character. But I loved kind of the whole idea with his dad and how he basically like tricked his like marooned like shipmates to basically eat this fruit that like deteriorated their mental state so he could kind of like control them. Like that was like really, really hard hitting and powerful. I also really like Jack's mission as well, where you kind of go back to the base where she was first trained and you kind of like learn more about her backstory, which I thought was really interesting as well. So yeah, lots of interesting stuff as far as side missions. As far as favorite characters, I mean, top waifu for me, because I have to throw it out there like that, is Tali. I love Tali. I love that she's like such a dork in all of the right ways. And I love all of Shepard's interactions with Tali. And I love too that eventually they added her as a romance option because that was something I was really hoping that they would do in the first game and they didn't do it. And yes, I know it's weird for her to be in a romance option because she can't really leave her suit or anything like that. Like her and Shepard can't really exist in like the same environment in a lot of ways. But I loved that as an option. You could go down that route even because, it's not just physicality that is what love's all about because there's lots to love besides that. So yeah, I really love that idea of having her as like a romance member, but that's not the only reason I like her as a character. Again, I really like her personality and all of the times that she interacts with you, especially whether she's in your party or not. Like if you're going just down to the engineering section to talk to her, I think all that stuff is really cool. So she's definitely my favorite character. And yeah, as far as Mike at Blaze Knight 0923's question, he's also got a whole bunch of like quick fire questions. So let's start it off with Ashley or Kaiden. So I always pick Ashley every time. Yes, I know she's a space racist and Kaiden didn't do anything wrong, but I don't know. I just never save Kaiden. Like even all the times when I like build up when playing Fed Shep that I'm gonna, romance Kaiden or something like that, I never end up saving him. Like I get to that choice and I'm like, no, I'm just gonna leave you here. I'm sorry. It happens every time. And it's not even like something I'm trying to do on purpose. It's like, no, in my heart of hearts, I know that I shouldn't save Kaiden. I've done it before, obviously. So I've played through the entire experience, like the entire trilogy with Kaiden surviving, but I just don't really like him as much as Ashley, I guess. Whereas Ashley, again, she's got her faults as a human being, but I also think she's a really interesting character too. And I love kind of her like family dynamic and stuff like that and what she talks about with her sisters and stuff like that. So yeah, I'd have to say Ashley versus Kaiden. Wrex or Grunt. I actually usually end up leaving Wrex behind or end up killing him off. So he usually doesn't survive past the thing. So I'm going to say Grunt by default, especially because like I love Grunt's camaraderie with Shepard and kind of like they have like this honorable kind of truce to them and like honorable relationship to them. Whereas like Wrex, especially since you only really have the first game with him, I feel like you don't get. I just didn't feel like I was ever too attached to Wrex in particular, which is why like sometimes I'll just play Mass Effect 1 and just leave him in front of the Citadel elevator and he just stands there until the Reapers attack and then you never see him again. It's because recruiting him is totally optional, so you don't actually have to bring him on your team or anything like that. So yeah, definitely gonna say Grunt on that one, especially because you have 2 full games with Grunt kind of to get to know him at least a little bit better. Why do you think they half backsided the DLC characters in Mass Effect 2 so hard? So if you're referring to, Mike, the 2 DLC characters being Zaid and Kasumi, I know with Zaid anyways, he was like a free update as part of like the Cerberus network, which was available just as like a free thing that you basically signed up for essentially. So he was never meant to be kind of like paid DLC or anything like that. So like his storyline's like very brief and you don't really do anything else with him besides that. So yeah, I can definitely understand that from that point of view. Whereas Kasumi, I feel like even though she only has her own one mission as well with her mission, which I'm just blanking on the name on right now. I feel like you get to know her pretty well on that mission. So for the most part, I wish they would have added, more, lines of dialogue with Kasumi and maybe on the ship or something like that. But I don't know. I felt like I got to know her enough that I was like satisfied with it anyways. Obviously you don't get to know her as well as the other characters, but I did like Kasumi's addition, and she's the type of character I will always have in my party because she's like ridiculously powerful. So there you go. Paragon or Renegade, Mike. I always go Renegade. I'm sorry. I mean, I always like try and play the games both ways. And I usually, I've played both games, fully Paragon or fully Renegade. But Renegade's just so much more fun, like punching reporters in the face, pushing people out the window. I love like playing kind of the bad guy or kind of the jerk in games because a lot of times when it's a narrative-based experience, you don't really get that point of view in a lot of ways. So it's like almost like refreshing to have a game where you can kind of be like a jerk like this. So yeah, I actually usually pick Renegade and go from there. But I usually don't do like a neutral set of choices or anything like that. I'm usually like one or the other. And 9 times out of 10, it's usually Renegade because that's just what I personally prefer to play. Maybe I'm just evil. Maybe that's the way of, you found out that I'm actually evil. Next up, male Shep versus female Shepard. Again, got to give it to female Shep on this one, mainly because Jennifer Hale, I think, is so much more of a talented voice actor than Mark Meer is. Don't get me wrong, I think Mark Meer does a fine performance as Shepard, but Jennifer Hale just takes it to another level. Like the amount of work she put into that role, I feel like you can feel the passion that she has for that character, like through her acting while you play that game. And I really felt really strongly attached to Jennifer Hale in that experience, and it made me respect her so much more, even though like I knew she did awesome roles in the past, like Bastila, for example, in Knights of the Republic. I loved her in that game too. But yeah, I loved her as Shepard. And generally, like, unless I really want to explore the male-only romance options, I never play as male Shepard anymore. It's only female Shepard, and that's it. And then last question, which character didn't make the Mass Effect 3 roster that you would like to have most in your squad at the end? So there's so many choices to choose from with this one because the Mass Effect 3 roster was, not super big. Like, it's definitely smaller than Mass Effect 2's, combined with the fact that you also had a new party member with, Freddie Prinze Jr.'s character, who, again, I'm blanking on his name at this point, who is a character I don't really like that much. So I would have loved to see just a bunch of different characters, actually, that didn't make it. Miranda, for example, from Mass Effect 2, I would have loved to see her in the party, or even Wrex, because, again, Wrex plays a pivotal role in Mass Effect 3. But maybe if you played it the right way, I would have loved to see him maybe come along for the ride with Shepard one last time. Like, I would have loved to see, like, basically the reunion of kind of like all the Mass Effect 1 characters in Mass Effect 3, I think would have been really cool. And then for the most part, like Jack, a lot of other Mass Effect 2 characters, like almost the entire roster is completely missing. And I would have loved to have all of them. In fact, like I wish it was almost like, and this might be weird or something that maybe not everyone checked out before, but with Fire Emblem Fates, what Nintendo did was they had the game kind of released in 3 different models. They released Birthright and Conquest, which were picked one of the 2 factions, whether it was Hoshido or Nor, and then you kind of got characters from that faction, and then you had basically the Revelations chapter of Fire Emblem Fates, which actually combined both parties together. And I would have loved to see that, but in Mass Effect 3, where essentially it was like this giant party of characters, like all of the characters that you had from, Mass Effect 1 and 2, I would have loved to see in your party in Mass Effect 3. I think that would have been amazing to see. So, yeah, I'm a little bummed that the roster missed out on a lot of people, but it did give a lot of fan service to the original characters from Mass Effect 1, which was definitely my favorite of the 2 games back when I played Mass Effect 3 for the first time. So I was definitely really happy that they had all those characters in there. But, yeah, for the most part, there's so many options for that one that it's hard to choose. But if I had to pick one, it'd be Miranda. She was the one I definitely wanted to come back the most. And that's going to do it for my spoiler-ific talks. Now let's go back to past Ryan for the rest of the show. And we're back. Thanks, Future Ryan, for the report on.
Thank you, Future Ryan.
all the spoilers. And I did kind of wrap up a lot of my thoughts too on kind of my thoughts on the overall story of Mass Effect and stuff like that. So we're gonna probably move on from here, Garrett. And it's time to talk about one of the things we always love to talk about on the show: the mechanics. It's time to break down some of the mechanics in Mass Effect, which I think are pretty cool. Now, so at the time that this game was coming out, Gears of War, for example, had just come out. So like cover shooters weren't like a huge thing, but were starting to become a lot more popular.
It was getting there.
Yeah. So you can definitely tell with Mass Effect 1 when you played it that like there is a cover system in it. It's not amazing, but it's there. Yeah. It's definitely cleaned up a bit in the Legendary Edition, but for the most part, like you don't really need to worry about cover too much. It becomes much more of a cover shooter though with Mass Effect 2 and 3. So
got it.
Because they really refined the combat in those 2 games, but it's for the most part it's a third-person shooter with RPG elements in a lot of ways. It kind of is almost like it's kind of like a more like strategic or tactical version of something like a sci-fi third-person shooter like an Advent Rising or a like Halo or something like that, or Gears of War or something like that. Like, but it's a little more tactical because you have abilities for all your different characters. Like you yourself have abilities, but then you've got abilities for your other 2 party members that you're actually bringing with you along the way. And the game time actually stops while you're going through the menu and actually picking all of the different skills out as well. You can also map them to your buttons on your controller as well.
Yes.
For ease of use. But a lot of times if I want to like plan things out, especially on some of the harder difficulties, usually even if it's mapped to my hotkey, I'll usually go into the menu anyway to kind of like order my guys around and then kind of like be a little more strategic than just picking, like just mashing buttons essentially at that point, which I think is actually pretty cool. Like I like how strategic you have to be with it, especially again, if you're playing the game on insane difficulty, which is the hardest difficulty in the game, because there is an achievement for beating it on that. You will actually need to utilize that a lot more and be a little more strategic because your guys will die very easily if you don't. But also, again, you can order your other 2 people around in your party and whatnot. Also, in all the Mass Effect games, you have access to 4 kind of major weapon types. You've got pistols, shotguns, sniper rifles, and assault rifles. And then depending on your character class, because you also have one of 6 character classes to basically choose from when you start the game, your ability to use certain weapons will be different depending on what your character class is. In the Legendary Edition, they changed Mass Effect 1 to make it so that you could use any of the weapons and it'd be totally fine regardless of what class you are. But then you have like specific abilities tied to specific weapon types depending on your class. But in Mass Effect 1, if you play the original version, essentially if you try and use the sniper rifle and you're not trained with it, your cursor will just do this and just go.
Oh, it's just impossible.
Yeah, it's just impossible to hit literally anything with it. So, and that kind of happens with all the weapons too, like the shotgun, for example. Like you can't aim it or it does like no damage. So you basically usually are kind of locked into kind of the classes that you kind of pick at the beginning, which, by the way, we should talk about the character classes because Garrett, what character class did you pick? Do you remember?
I think I picked soldier. That's a class, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
That's the default one. Yeah.
Yeah, I picked the well-balanced one. I was like, all right, let's see how this soldier character goes. So what other classes are involved? I think I just kind of glossed over this part.
So the character classes, so soldier, first of all, is a character class that basically has a bunch of gun skills. So you basically have all the gun skills that I kind of referred to, but for all 4 weapon types essentially. And it was also the only character class in the original game, like the original version, that could use all of the weapons without them, again, doing what I described with the cursors
like
for the sniper rifles.
Crazy, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So then you have a bunch of abilities for each of those weapons. Plus you have, you can wear the best armor in the game because you can wear the heavy armor, and it's the only character class that Shepard that can wear heavy armor. So it's actually you're the most defensive. You're almost like a tank kind of character in a lot of ways, but you're kind of like a weapons expert. But then you've got the other kind of ability. The classes kind of go into other different abilities, whether they're either tech abilities, which are more like technology based, or biotic abilities, which is almost like space magic in a lot of ways. It kind of reminds me of the Force in a lot of ways. And then you kind of have so the other 5 classes are essentially mixed into some matches of that. So the Vanguard, for example, will basically take some of the weapon abilities from the soldier, with shotguns and pistols, but then mix them with biotic abilities. So then you can essentially use powers to basically like throw people. So you'll throw basically this like beam of energy at someone and they'll like fly through the air, or you can throw them in like a stasis bubble. So they're basically like stun locked essentially. So you can take out all the other enemies around them at the time. Or on the other side of the frame, you have like a combat oriented tech user called the Engineer, the Sentinel, which essentially uses sniper rifles and pistols, but then uses tech powers. And tech powers are used for like taking down enemies' shields or barriers, or giving you advanced healing abilities and stuff like that. So and they kind of mix and match from there. Again, you've got a dedicated tech user that doesn't have any weapon abilities, but it has like very strong technical abilities. And same with the biotic that has all of the biotic powers. And then you also have a class that basically blends the two of them together. So you have tech powers and biotic abilities, but not combat abilities. So you can play it a bunch of different ways. So like they all feel like very different from each other. And then in Mass Effect 2, what they did is they added like a unique ability to each one of the classes. So they really feel like really different from each other going past the first game. So
that's really, really cool. Now, with all these different classes and traits and everything, that I guess pushes you, and choices as well, it pushes you to replay these games like a lot, right? Or especially the first Mass Effect game, but what about 2 and 3 as well?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of replay value there, both from the choices and the classes and whatnot. And also, if you want to get all the achievements or the Platinum Trophy, for example, you do have to meet, like Mass Effect 1, for example, you have to beat that 12 times with the original version.
Wow. Okay.
Except for the Legendary Edition, where they did change all the trophies and achievements around.
Okay, good.
To make them a little bit easier to get. So you don't have to be like Ryan, because I actually have like the Platinum Trophy equivalent for Mass Effect 1, which again meant beating the game that many
12 times.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. In order to get that, because it was ridiculous. But so I there's a lot of replay value. It's a game that I've actually replayed a lot and really enjoyed for that reason, because you can actually go back and replay it, making a bunch of different choices, or even like sometimes what I'll like to do now is like blend like some of the evil and good choices kind of together, and then kind of make almost like this hodgepodge to kind of see what happens. So I really love kind of how all that kind of comes together. So,
and does it ever feel disjointed, like at all? Like if you try to mix these good and bad endings together?
No, I think it actually works pretty well.
That's actually brilliant. Yeah. That's very surprising to hear, because when I hear a lot of games trying to do these like good and bad endings, and like I remember a lot of games, it's like, hey, we have 7 different endings, and I'm like, good Lord. I'm surprised to hear that, you know, with all this web of choices or whatever, it still blends together really well.
I will say like the ending in Mass Effect 3 in particular is
controversial.
Is controversial, I would say. And again, I talked about it kind of in the spoilery section as far as, you know, my thoughts on that, because we did get a question about that. But I do think it still ties together in an interesting way. But yeah, like for example, when you beat Mass Effect 1, like the choice is going to your choices are going to reflect the ending in that game, and it's going to feel really natural regardless of, you know, what choices you made along the way, which again is just a huge testament to, you know, BioWare's game design, especially because we don't really see that. Like to your point, we don't see that in a lot of different games really going super well. But as far as the mechanics go, you're also fighting a bunch of different like alien creatures along the way, whether you're fighting like organic creatures or, you know, more robotic creatures like the Geth. The tactics you have to employ against them will be different depending on what you're fighting. For example, like most tech powers don't work well against organics. So if you're fighting like
that makes sense,
like an actual like a beast or something like that on a planet, you know, trying to, you know, short out their shields doesn't do anything. But and likewise, like not all biotic powers work on like non-living organisms. So
got it.
And then you kind of like if you kind of know what the mission structure is going to be kind of like, or what kind of enemies you're going to be fighting, you kind of try and tailor your party towards that if you want to be a little more strategic, because all your party members will all have one of the 6 classes I talked about assigned to them, essentially. And it'll actually tell you in kind of the party selection screen, they're strong at like this person's strong at this and weak with this kind of thing. So yeah.
So what I'm very surprised about when I was playing the beginning of this game is the amount of introduction of lore there is in the codex. And they've done a really good job of doing this, where you're kind of introduced to like a certain part of the game, whether it's like the council, a certain race, a building, whatever. And they really get into a deep dive into like the narration of these little codex, and it's very helpful. I'm very grateful to see that, and it's voice acted. Like
it talks to you,
and it's very well voice acted too. Just going through, I'm like, oh sweet, I can listen to this while I like look at my phone or something like that, and it's actually a very good way of storytelling. I wish it was like a little bit more like BioShock, where you could like roam around as you hear it, but it's still a very good way to introduce what this lore is, because I'm getting more and more invested as I go through each of these codex.
Especially like learning about all the different alien races and kind of how they all came about and how they all like kind of met up at the Citadel, this one kind of like central hub for the universe in a lot of ways, is like really interesting. And then eventually when you get to the planetary exploration as well, like that's super interesting as well, because each planet you go to in the solar system, and there's like, I think there's like 100 planets in Mass Effect 1, for example, to go to. Each one of them has their own like lore description of that specific planet that you go to, and with a bunch of like scientific facts about that planet, because again, the 2 founders of BioWare were doctors. So you could definitely tell like they went into like minute detail about like each planet and stuff like that, like how much gravitational mass like that planet has and stuff like that. Like it's really
there was one about one race that had to use pressure suits. I forgot exactly which race it was, but basically
the Volus, I think.
The Volus, yes. And that planet, they were like, hey, they're ammonia-based creatures, so they have like a low-pressure system, and they have to wear these special suits if they want to be outside of their planet. I'm like, that is science. That's like science fiction to a T. It makes sense. I thought it was super neat to see.
And that kind of goes back to what I was talking about before with the writing, as far as like all the characters feel like they could actually exist in real life. And then you go look at the lore, and it just like all put like ties into that too, and how like they feel like real creatures that actually could exist in real life, which is just super cool to really think about. And again, just how much writing went into even just doing all the lore stuff. Like I can't even imagine, especially like when you go to some of the other planets too and see some of the lore like codex on each planet and stuff like that beyond kind of the cursory one for each planet as well. Like it's so interesting just how that works. Well, speaking of mechanics, eventually, Garrett, you will have the ability to go travel from planet to planet, and you get access to the Mako, which is kind of this ground vehicle, and essentially you can just drive around the planet and kind of explore at your leisure. And if you're someone,
it's like No Man's Sky.
It is kind of like in a lot of ways, like it kind of like predated that in a lot of ways. Whereas like I know like Sean Capri and I've talked about it many times, where like sometimes I would just take the Mako and just drive around for like an hour.
Oh, that's so cool.
And then just go explore this planet, because it kind of reminded me of like all the best parts of space exploration and just like exploring a new place that you'll never really be able to go to in real life. Like it's just really, really cool. Like all the planets are just really different from each other. I mean, there's some planets that are just super cold, and they'll just be cold as soon as you go outside the ship, which will then mean it kind of limit your exploration, versus you'll go to like lush jungle planets and stuff like that. Like there's a lot of planet variety in the first Mass Effect, but in Mass Effect 2 and 3, they kind of took a lot of that away. They kind of took away a lot of the planetary exploration, where essentially you've still got all the lore from each planet, but as you go to the planet itself, you're mostly just scanning it from space. And then if there's a mission there, you'll do like an on-foot mission in like a contained area. And then that's kind of it. So they take away a lot of like that open worldness that's in Mass Effect 1. So it's actually like they kind of contrast with each other in a lot of ways, which actually brings in a question that I got from Todd Oxtra Todd. I guess he reversed his name on Twitter now. He asked the question,
nice.
Do you wish that they kept the game mechanics the same as Mass Effect 1 for all the games, or would you have liked all the games to be in the style of 2 or 3? So again, since you've only played 1, Garrett, you haven't really been able to see the differences between some of the games. Because again, they take out a lot of the RPG elements, such as, the point screen that's in Mass Effect 1, where you're assigning skill points and stuff like that. It's like overly simplified in Mass Effect 2 and 3.
Really?
Where essentially like you basically have like 4 points for each of your skills essentially. And then you level everything up pretty quickly. So for the most part, you're not leveling like charm or a lot of the other like different abilities that you kind of have in Mass Effect 1, which is different. Again, for RPG fans like us, I know from me personally, I wish they would have included a lot of that stuff in the later games. Like more of the minutia is kind of lost. And then the planetary exploration, I would definitely say, is one of the things that like I really miss from the first one that they didn't bring back in 2 or 3. It just it hurts that you're just going around and doing some scanning, like spinning around the globe of the planet, kind of from your little computer on your ship, and then basically scanning the planet that way. Essentially, like it's not as fun as going around there and just basically driving around that planet. Essentially, so I do wish that a lot more of the game mechanics in the style from 1 carried over to a lot of the other games. Yes, I know they don't always. It's like not all of them work in super accessible ways, but at the same time, I wish it would have stayed more of a traditional RPG over the course of the 3 games. Whereas again,
so I'm just wondering. I hear Mass Effect 2 as being everyone's like favorite out of the series, and I'm wondering. I'm hearing a lot of praise from 1 coming from you, which with your reasons. Why is 2 more of the popular out of the 3?
Well, fun fact, I actually like Mass Effect 2 more because I actually love the story in Mass Effect. Because I love the story in 2 more. Like that's the thing that really got me with 2. The combat is still fun in Mass Effect 2. In fact, if anything, I think the combat is probably more fun. But they had to sacrifice a lot in order to kind of change the combat around, I feel like. Okay. And I don't necessarily know if that changes for the better, if that makes sense. But I think everyone we talked to about Mass Effect who have played the trilogy has kind of a different opinion on this as far as like what kind of combat systems they prefer. And it's always like, it's the type of situation kind of like when comparing Star Wars movies together, where like most people usually are saying Mass Effect 1 or 2 is their favorite, essentially. That's what most people say.
Just fighting between both of them,
Yeah, Mass Effect 3 is probably not many people's favorites, but I've definitely heard some people say that too. But definitely the first two are like most beloved in people's eyes. And I think it has to do a lot with the story for the first two games. It's definitely like the main draw for those two games. But yeah, the combat itself actually feels really good, but it feels much closer to a, Gears of War or something like that when you get to 2 and 3, essentially, versus the first game. So
one more question. I know there was some DLC not being imported over to the Mass Effect Legendary Edition. Is that any of importance? Is that vital to your experience? What is the DLC like in these games?
So there was only 2 DLC packs released for Mass Effect 1. There was a mission called Bring Down the Sky, which you'll get to, which is actually in the Legendary Edition. Then the other piece of DLC was called, I think it's called Pinnacle Station is what it's called, where it was essentially this space station you would go to, and there was basically a bunch of like training missions you would go do, where essentially you'd fight enemies in waves, and it didn't really matter to the story. It was just kind of its own thing. In a way, it was almost there to help level your characters in a lot of ways, or give you like armor sets so that you were better prepared to tackle some of the higher difficulties, I feel like. So that was more the reason why that DLC was there, and less of like, don't get me wrong, there is some lore there, but it's like, it's not important to anything else you ever do in this entire game. So
I gotcha.
Yeah, I wouldn't worry about it too much. And again, the one mission that actually does matter is there. And apparently the story behind Pinnacle Station and why it wasn't included in the Legendary Edition was like, they apparently lost the source code for it. So they didn't want to rebuild. They didn't want to rebuild it from scratch. So they just said, it's not that important anyways. So let's just call it a day. It's not like Kingdom Hearts 1 where where Square Enix lost the whole game and they basically had to rebuild Kingdom Hearts 1 from scratch. It's not like that. It was just a piece of DLC where they just they didn't really care about it.
Isn't that crazy that these people are able to lose the source code?
You'd see this, but this is like happened like more often than you'd think, as far as like someone who studies video game history.
I actually went to the Gearbox studio once upon a time, and they were talking about how many like backup contingency plans they have if they lost like some of their work due to a blackout or something like that, because that happens. It's just like, maybe one day these servers will shut down because of a random blackout, and you might lose data. And it's like, that's crazy to hear.
Yeah. Well, especially too, like it's a story we hear a lot with like older games, especially like
older
Xbox 360 era, because a lot of publishers, I feel like, and this comes down to like a lot of stuff we hear with like licensing too, where they never really thought about the legacy of their games, like re-releasing their games later type of thing. Like not everyone thought about that type of thing, in 1993 when they were developing games for Super Nintendo. So that's how a lot of that stuff gets lost anyways, or they just, it's not so much lost so much as like, we're never going to re-release this game again anyway. So why do we need to keep all this stuff kind of thing? Or like when a company gets bought out, for example, like that's the type of thing that happens there too. So, but yeah, so that's the deal with that. Whereas all the DLC in Mass Effect 2 and 3 is all there. So you're actually not missing any of it. And actually the DLC in 2 or 3 is much more integral to the story than Mass Effect 1's DLC is.
Sounds good.
So it is definitely worth playing when you actually do get to that point. So, or likewise, if someone's out there listening for the first time who is just picking up this collection this year for the first time, definitely play the DLC for Mass Effect 2 and 3. It's not only really well written and really good, but also it kind of matters to the lore. And then one of the coolest things they do with the DLC, if you play it in 1 and 2, is since your save game carries over, the choices you make in the DLC also matter with other stuff that happens in the base game. Whereas if you get to the point where like one of those things comes up and you haven't played the DLC, it just explains the situation to you as if you're hearing it for the first time kind of thing. So it knows whether or not you've played, Bring Down the Sky or any of the stuff from Mass Effect 2 or 3's DLC, which is like
that's pretty intelligent. That's pretty crafty what they did. And I guess they kind of knew they were doing 3 games. Yeah, they were like, all right, we're starting this, and we are gonna connect our choices. And yeah, that's
Okay, yeah, I mean, the story was definitely planned from the beginning, and it was definitely conceived as a trilogy. Again, it was like they'd start planning around the time that we got stuff like the Lord of the Rings trilogy or the Matrix trilogy, where like Hollywood was starting to go in that direction. So that was definitely like I know that Casey Hudson, for example, when kind of pitching the idea for Mass Effect, like that's kind of where that idea kind of came from, was from Hollywood.
Well, they also did that with Dragon Age as well, right?
Yeah.
Like, I don't think they initially said, hey, this is a trilogy, but that's what they kind of did. They kind of just connected their choices.
Well, they didn't also develop it in the same way as they did this, where they were actually developing, the same team developed all 3 games for Mass Effect. And they were all kind of being developed kind of at the same time in a lot of ways. And that's why they actually came out so close together, because like there wasn't like a huge amount of time between all 3 Mass Effect games, or definitely not as long of a time wait as you would have expected anyways for 3 giant games like these ones in particular. So
got it.
All the planning was definitely there for that. And also, Garrett, I don't know if you knew this because you haven't played Mass Effect 3 yet, but did you know that Mass Effect 3 has a multiplayer mode?
I did, yes. I heard it's one of the better multiplayer modes, but it's not in Legendary Edition.
That's correct.
It's just,
So they didn't bring back the Mass Effect DLC. And this kind of, the reason I asked about this is that Todd Oxtra also had a follow-up to his question and asked, do we wish the multiplayer for Mass Effect was still around? And as someone who played the Mass Effect multiplayer, it was almost like playing like Horde mode from Gears of War, if you've played that before, where you basically team up with some allies. Like it's not PvP or anything like that. And you're basically taking out waves of enemies, essentially. Kind of like that DLC I kind of just described that's missing from the game, essentially. Like they basically took that concept and expanded it into like this multiplayer suite. And then actually the multiplayer, depending on how like basically you would get resources from multiplayer and then you would bring them into your single player campaign. And then depending on what resources you got from multiplayer, it would actually affect the ending of Mass Effect 3. Which was really interesting and cool to see. So, like it actually tied the multiplayer into the single player for Mass Effect 3 in like a really like interesting way. In the Legendary Edition to kind of compensate for the fact that the multiplayer is not there, they just gave you like in campaign ways to get the same things essentially.
Okay.
So again, you'll find out more about that when you get there, Garrett. But I'm kind of
I'll get there. I think I'll blaze through these games next year. Once I'm done with Shin Megami Tensei and Pokemon. That's
a lot of RPG right there.
I know. So it's a marathon, not a race.
Yeah, exactly.
Just get through it one at a time.
Oh yeah. So the multiplayer itself, I had a fun time with it. I think it was actually pretty good. Like I know we kind of like laughed about the idea of them doing a Mass Effect multiplayer at the time because this was around the time period where, a bunch of other single player only games were doing multiplayer, like the Tomb Raider reboot multiplayer, or like Dead Space 2's multiplayer, or the Darkness's multiplayer. Like that's some of like the worst multiplayer I've ever played in like any games. So we were all thinking that maybe Mass Effect would end up being the same way, but no, it actually like turned out to be a lot of fun. So cool. I hope that maybe they bring back the idea of doing Mass Effect multiplayer in a future release. But yeah, for right now, like I can understand why they didn't bring it back for Legendary Edition, because I feel like they'd probably have to put a lot of resources into it in order to bring it back, and I just don't think they're willing
and maintain those servers. And there's not going to be a lot of people playing that.
Yeah, exactly.
They're really revisiting the game as the single player.
Yeah, exactly. And especially to experience the entire trilogy, but then not be able to play the multiplayer until you get to the third game, like that doesn't make any sense for a lot of people, right? So, but anyways, I think that does it for mechanics. I should talk real quick, though, about Mass Effect Andromeda, which actually takes place after all the Mass Effect games, but it takes place in a completely different universe. It takes place in the Andromeda galaxy versus the Milky Way galaxy that Mass Effect takes place in. And it basically takes place like hundreds and hundreds of years after Mass Effect's ending. It's its own beast. But I have to bring in Seumas MacIsaac at Famous Seumas, who asks, what do you think about Andromeda after all these years? So Mass Effect Andromeda was like a game that I really, really wanted to like, but I just couldn't get into it because there's a lot of repetitive enemies in that game. There's also some story stuff that I didn't really love with the game. I haven't gone back and replayed it recently. The last time I checked it out was 2019 was the last time I played this game. Because I think it came out in like
2017.
2017. Yeah. There you go. Thank you, Garret. So it was a long. I played it again after 2 years, thinking maybe I would enjoy it more, and I didn't. In fact, if you want to know more about it, I'm going to link it in the show notes. But I actually did a Mass Effect Andromeda spoiler cast on my old podcast called Game Moose with my friend Drew McMillan, who was also like a huge Mass Effect person. Both Drew and I really love Mass Effect, so we were both very excited when Andromeda came out, and he was definitely harsher on it than I was, but I definitely think like I personally don't love that game. I do think it has some good qualities. Like I like the characters in Andromeda, and I like kind of like the world building that they do in that game. But there's just a lot of stuff that I don't like with that game. So I'm gonna link this for you, Seumas, because I know you've probably played it. So definitely check out the spoiler cast that I did all the way back when the game came out back in 2017 to kind of like hear more what I have to say about Mass Effect Andromeda. So last thing I wanted to touch on before we kind of get to the rest of our questions for this show, Mass Effect 4 has been announced. And again, even though there's 4 Mass Effect games already, they're referring to this one as Mass Effect 4 because it's going to continue after Mass Effect 3 and kind of like pretend Andromeda doesn't exist. Or this will take place in the Milky Way galaxy. So in a way, like...
Or it'll take, before, right? Before Mass Effect Andromeda, possibly.
Well, yeah.
If it's hundreds of years apart.
Yeah, it looks like it's going to have like... Because this was announced at the Game Awards last year, which is actually like funny enough, we're coming up on the 1-year anniversary of this project actually being announced. And then like the reveal trailer, they showed some of your crewmates from Mass Effect 1 in it. So I would assume you're taking on the role of some of your characters that you know from the first game and going from there. So I'm curious to know, Garret, as someone who's new to the franchise, taking the story completely out of it, is there anything in particular you as a new Mass Effect game fan want to see from a game like this from Mass Effect 4?
Well, I would really like to play Mass Effect 2 and 3 now, just because of what you said about the gameplay mechanics being very different. It seems like it's a little less RPG, more action-based focused in terms of its mechanics and combat. So I'm going to wait for my opinions on what Mass Effect 4 mechanics should be until I play those two, see which ones that I think it's better. I think the first Mass Effect game, I could tell the date, it's dated, the mechanics a little bit. It's very obvious, but it's still a lot of fun. I'm still having a great time going through a bunch of these enemies with those mechanics. Mass Effect 4, though, I don't know. I think BioWare is trying to announce these games left and right, and we gotta just look at it face value. It's like, you are not the same BioWare as you were 10 years ago. And so why should we trust you? Now that we've gone through this kind of like terrible iterations of course, Mass Effect, Andromeda's lukewarm reception, and also Anthem being a mess up that it is. And then we're just hearing like kind of weird conflicting development issues with Dragon Age 4. Which again, I would like to I'm more interested in Dragon Age 4. See what that game is like. Give us a gameplay trailer instead of like concept art for the past 3 years. So what I would like Mass Effect 4 to do is don't market it so grand. Don't make it as, hey, this is the return of Mass Effect. This is the lovable trilogy that you know and love. They need a refresh. If they're going back to these series, it's fine if you're wanting to use the old characters, that's fine. But like, make a bottom up approach instead of a top down approach. Know what your mechanics are and make sure that's fun. I'm thinking of studios that are doing it very well these days, and I'm thinking of Obsidian in the Outer Worlds. I think that's a good template to look at now and see you can put that type of RPG elements into a Mass Effect game. So that's my thoughts on it. They need to be very patient with both of these games that they're making, and I hope to see Dragon Age 4 actual gameplay and just see what that looks like first before they even say what they're going to do with Mass Effect 4.
Yeah, exactly. Especially because like Dragon Age is the one we keep waiting for. But again, like we just had a news story, I think this week, that the director of that game left the studio. So it's just like, who knows what's even going on with that game and when it's even coming out at this point. Like if anything, like we were thinking it was going to come out maybe next year or the year after, but like, I don't know, man. I think that it's kind of like getting close to Metroid Prime 4 territory where it's going to be like a 2024, 2025 game. Like it might even be like, well, I was about to say like a next gen console game, but I mean, it's already on. It's going to be already on the current gen consoles, I guess. But like, it'll definitely be out before, you know, the next round of consoles come out. But going back to what you said, I thought you said something really interesting, Garrett, and this is kind of how I feel about it. Is like, I kind of want like it to be a completely like refresh of the series too. Like, if anything, I kind of don't want it to be the original characters, if that makes any sense. Like, one of the reasons I was so excited for Andromeda was like it tried to do something completely different and then try and give you a brand new set of characters to care about. And I think that with a big, you know, long running series of movies, for example, like looking at something like Star Wars, like I think the biggest problem with a series like Star Wars, for example, with the main movies is that it focuses too much on the Skywalkers and basically that core set of characters
like all the time
throughout all 9 films. Which is just by the time you get to the end of it, you're not feeling it. And I kind of feel like if they bring all the old characters back again for Mass Effect, you might start to get into that territory. So I would have that's why like I really wanted Andromeda to be good, because I loved the idea of having like a brand new set of characters, like almost doing like a Mass Effect reboot in a lot of ways. And I really wish that was kind of what we were getting with this game instead, as well as maybe like a different reboot, but in like the same galaxy as Mass Effect. So maybe you might have like cameos from some of the other characters and whatnot, or you just have a lot of the same alien races that you have from Mass Effect, but you don't necessarily like, it doesn't have to tie into Shepard or anything like that, especially because like that world feels so personal with your save from Mass Effect carrying over all of these years. And, you know, with this new game, is your save going to bring in some of your decisions from the previous games, since it's going to be linked to those characters? Or is it just going to like, or are they going to be like almost like different versions of those characters? Because again, my, Ashley, for example, at the end of, Mass Effect 3 is going to probably feel very different than yours, Garrett, based on the choices I made throughout the game. And if that doesn't carry into this next game, if Ashley comes back from Mass Effect 4, like it's going to be a real feel bad in a lot of ways, or it's just going to feel weird in a lot of ways to kind of go back to that. So I really hope that if they're bringing the old characters back, I hope it's in a minor way versus you just going on another adventure with them. Because I feel like you kind of did everything you wanted to do with them in the trilogy. So that's kind of my thoughts on that. But then kind of to round things up with our final thoughts, Garrett, we should get through some of these questions that we got from the community.
Good questions.
We got some more questions. And these are more just generic Mass Effect questions that we're kind of thrown into here. Just like Seumas MacIsaac at Famous Seumas once again asks, am I the only one who thinks there should be a strategy game based on Mass Effect? Something akin to XCOM or Gears Tactics. I think the gameplay would perfectly fit well with the Mass Effect universe. So, Garrett, I think that this idea is awesome. I would actually love to see something like this, especially with what I told you about like the powers and different classes and stuff like that. Like imagine that level of, tacticalness, but with like a tactics game. Like how cool would that be? What do you think about this idea?
I would definitely be in front of the line pre-ordering that game if that ever come to fruition. I really do like these tactical turn-based strategy games, and even the new ones that are coming out that are kind of indie and just like putting in new mechanics and whatnot, trying to follow the XCOM template. But yeah, having a Mass Effect lore and having the gameplay of, let's say, XCOM, that's like a dream come true type of RPG for me.
Yeah.
I'm ready to do that.
I mean, it sounds like one of those times to use the shut up and let me give you my money kind of gifts just to pull that
pretty much
the fry out, essentially. That's
probably never going to happen.
That's 2 Futurama references in one show, by the way. But folks,
there you go.
And then Seumas MacIsaac also asks, what are your thoughts on the recent reports of Amazon making a Mass Effect series? So at the time of this recording, this is not confirmed. We just know that Amazon is in talks to do a Mass Effect series. And this was actually kind of hinted by Henry Cavill on Instagram, because when he was kind of posting during the filming of The Witcher 2, the season 2 for The Witcher, he had actually posted a picture with like he had a printout of the Mass Effect wiki page essentially that he was reading, kind of hinting that like maybe Amazon was going to be, Amazon actually working on that, and maybe he was going to apply for maybe, one of the rules in Mass Effect. So I'm curious to know what they would actually do with this. Like, I know what I'm like, you probably already know what I'm going to say this, but I have to ask you, Garrett, as a new fan, would you prefer that they do like a retelling of the game that you're currently playing, or do you want to see them do something different with it, with the series?
Oh, do not retell this. I don't think this is a game or a lore that's meant to be retold in a show or a movie format. But I really am enjoying these video game, TV show adaptations, especially the animation adaptations like Castlevania and Arcane. Arcane is one of my favorite shows that I watched this year. So I'm totally on board to see a Mass Effect series type of show in the works and in like through Amazon or through Netflix or whatever. It sounds like maybe if it's coming from Henry Cavill, it's going to be more of a live, real life kind of.
Well, they've done animated
adaptation.
Mass Effect stuff before because they did like I know Funimation actually partnered with a Japanese studio to do like a Mass Effect anime. That was like a one episode in the run, and then they did like a movie where it was essentially about this character from Mass Effect 3 that you'll meet in that game, who's like one of your party members in that game. And it was kind of tied with that game. But yeah, with live action stuff, I would imagine it'll be whatever this will be, it'll be live action for sure.
Okay, that sounds good. I'm interested to see, but live action sci-fi shows, I don't know, they're not like it's a niche audience. It's not like everyone's cup of tea. I know some people really, really get into those type of shows, but I don't know if that would hit the mainstream as much. What about you, Ryan? What do you think of Mass Effect series?
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. I do not want a retelling of Mass Effect. I do want it to be kind of its own thing, but I think this universe is ripe with a bunch of different stories. And that's what is kind of the most exciting thing about it. Is like they could kind of do, again, just to bring the Star Wars comparison back in again, they could do kind of what, what Disney is doing with the Star Wars series, where they're doing a bunch of different side stories like the Mandalorian or the Boba Fett show and stuff like that. Like have them either about like ancillary characters from Mass Effect 1, like, or that you maybe meet in side quests, or just have them be with original characters. Like, I think that's what I would love to see from the Mass Effect series. Because again, this universe is really interesting and deep and very sprawling with a whole bunch of different locations and interesting characters and alien types that, again, like most of the aliens that you encounter in this game for the most part are, humanoid aliens. So I definitely think that they could make it work with, great makeup effects and stuff like that. Like I think that they could actually make the live action series look really cool. But yeah, I definitely don't want to see it retelling because, again, it kind of goes back to what I was talking about before with Mass Effect 4, where, again, it'll feel like almost like a disjointed experience for anyone who's played the games because the Shepard, if they bring Shepard to stream, like it'll be like not my personal Shepard. It won't be, the Shepard that I know. So it'll feel like a completely different character. And it's not like adapting something like The Last of Us to film or something like that. Cause like that's one, cinematic experience that for the most part is just unchanged, whether you bring it to, regardless of what medium you kind of bring it to. Whereas Mass Effect's not like that. Like it's more of a personal experience. So you would lose a lot of what makes that special by doing a retelling of the first game or the first couple.
That makes sense.
Plus also those games are long, man. Imagine, like, I can't even imagine how many episodes, like the fact that that Netflix, for example, couldn't do the entire season of Cowboy Bebop, which was only a 1-season TV show in one season, goes to tell you everything you need to know about how they would approach something like this, where essentially, like, if they were to retell the Mass Effect trilogy of stories, like, they'd need like 10 seasons to do it if they wanted to tell everything.
They really need, when they look at existing franchises, either video games or books or whatever, like, you could draw characters from there, but like make something new and make a new storyline for them. That would make sense, or the length of it makes sense for a TV show. I think Arcane, the show that's based off of the League of Legends, fantastic. I don't know anything about League of Legends. I don't care about League of Legends, the game, but that show, they just build these characters and these relationships and a great story from that lore. So
well, especially that
I can
show,
see success.
that show in particular, like you have like a couple characters from League of Legends, but for the most part, it's mostly original characters. Like that's one of the things that makes it special. Like it can exist at its own thing and be awesome, and then it brings people into League of Legends. Like it does what you want it to do without having to do a retelling. So yeah, that's the type of approach I would love to see with Mass Effect. Because again, that doesn't mean you can't have any of the characters from the first game. It just means like just don't make them central characters is all I would say.
Yeah.
Unless they're again like a side character or whatnot. And then last question of the week comes to us from TPR, and this is a bit of a paragraph, so stick with me for just a second. As someone who is typically foreign to the RPG genre because of the sheer amount of time it takes to complete many of them, like 45 plus hours of commitment. And by the way, TPR, that's not necessarily true. We've talked about that in the show before. There's lots of shorter RPGs. I think we've talked about that a few times, especially if you go back and listen to our RPGs for Beginners episode, we actually highlight a lot of shorter games as well. But how do the Mass Effect games land on the spectrum individually? I'm much more keen to jump into games that the total play time doesn't exceed about 25 hours cumulatively. Something that also that is faster paced progression makes me value the time sink a lot more. I know on this episode where you discussed RPGs to try out, Fire Emblem Awakening was a good example of this, clocking in at about 20 hours, according to Ryan, which again actually ties back to what I was just talking about. So good on you. I forgot that you mentioned that. Anyways, excited to hear your thoughts on this. So Garrett, I know you don't have anything to say because you haven't played these games, whereas me, I would say that it's definitely an RPG that actually respects your time. That's one of the things I really like about it as well. It kind of reminds me of Skyrim in a lot of ways, in the sense that there's a ton of side stuff to do in Mass Effect, but if you just want to get through the main story and you just want to get through the campaign, you don't have to worry about it. So, and if you just want to mainline the campaign, you can probably do it in 10 hours if you want to for Mass Effect 1.
That's
and then
not bad.
Mass Effect 2 and 3 are a bit longer than that, but like, if you want to complete the trilogy and you don't want to do a ton of the side stuff, you can probably finish it in 40 or 50 hours. The trilogy.
That's not
just
bad at
one
all.
game. So I think you can get that through all three games at a respectable rate if you don't want to go down that road. At the same time, you're missing some incredible content because I think some of the game's best content is some of the side stuff as well. So I definitely think a lot of that stuff is worth playing, especially in Mass Effect 2, because the way that game is kind of set up, it kind of forces you to play some of the side stuff if you want to, because it affects the ending a lot more if you don't do it, versus the other two games in particular. So that's unique to that particular game. But for the most part, I think that the side content is really compelling in these games. So I would definitely recommend checking it out for sure. But
Sounds good.
I think it's an acceptable length anyways, especially with most of the RPGs we talk about on this show, Garrett. Like,
like Persona.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, but like Mass Effect 1 in particular, like I told this story on the Xbox Drive this week because we had talked about Xbox 20. They did the Xbox Museum this week. Garrett, I don't know if you actually saw that. Yeah. And it gave you personal stats for the Xbox games you had actually played the most. And mine was actually the original Mass Effect because literally my brother Corey would come over every single weekend for 3 months and then play Mass Effect 1 from start to finish within a weekend. And you would just like finish it and then go home. And it would take him like 8 to 10 hours to finish it. And again, that's not him skipping through any of the dialogue or anything like that. That's just him.
He's just going through it,
mainlining the story and just enjoying it. So yeah, I think you can definitely have a good time just mainlining the story if you want to go that route. It's not my recommended route, but yeah, it's definitely a much better, time waster, or it's much better about respecting your time than some.
There's
other
not really
RPGs.
a grind to it like a JRPG. There's a lot of great handcrafted content, and that's what I get from a lot of these older BioWare games. They're just they really do respect your time, whether it's Dragon Age or Mass Effect.
A lot of that actually comes in with the combat balance too, where like I never felt, even playing it for the first time, that I was ever underleveled for anything that I was taking on, especially if you're playing on like normal difficulty, for example. And then since you can play the game in New Game Plus with the same character, with all the same stats and everything, that's when it expects you to play kind of the higher difficulty stuff. And even then, like, unless you start off your first playthrough on Insanity, for the most part, you're kind of getting through the game, at a pretty good pace without being too challenged either.
Cool.
Yeah. I'd definitely say that it's definitely good in that regard. Last thing, Garrett, it's not on the dock, but I wanted to surprise you with this because I have to ask.
Oh, okay.
You're on the Citadel, so I know that there's a possibility that this has happened yet, but maybe you haven't interacted with this character yet. But have you met Conrad Werner on the Citadel? Have you talked to
Conrad Werner? What's his role?
So
I don't really like names.
He's a human on the Citadel. He kind of has like blonde hair, and he's your biggest fan. He is Commander Shepard's.
I have not met this guy.
Okay, because you can actually meet him like the very first time you go there. Basically as soon as you start exploring the Citadel. So
I'll have to check around.
He's in the wards. You should go if you see Conrad Werner's name pop up. Go talk to Conrad Werner because, oh boy. It's interesting.
Sounds good. I will report back.
Also, a fun fact for those that listen to the spoiler part of it, you know what I'm talking about because I talked about it there. But anyways, Garrett, we got to go. I think like this show is long enough because we're already at an hour 8 minutes before Future Ryan jumps in here. So before we go, Garrett, let's go.
Well, I'm very much looking forward to playing these 3 games pretty soon, and I will report back my thoughts on these throughout next year. But yeah, you can follow me on Twitter at Bland Explosion, and I'm also a co-host to Nintendo Shack, part of the Play Some Video Games Podcast Network. We are live Thursday nights at around 8:30 Eastern Standard Time over at twitch.tv/PSVG, and you can support them over at patreon.com/PSVG.
Very nice, my friend. As for me, you can find me on Twitter at Ryan Turford. You can find us on Twitter at Yumi Capriz, on YouTube at youtube.com/Yumi Capri, and on podcast services around the globe. So for Garrett Bland, I'm Ryan Turford. This has been level 28 of the RPG Cave, and we're out.
Bye-bye.
The RPG Cave's mana is fueled by patrons over at patreon.com/Yumi Capri. And I want to say thanks to each and every one of our Patreon supporters for all of your support throughout the years, as well as supporting our independent content. And let's start by thanking our premium producers, Dallas Ford, Lee Navarro, the fearless leader of the Phoenix Overdrive Extra Life team, and Jonathan Brown. You can find his content over at youtube.com/PM Entertainment. Our platinum producers, Robbie Bobby Mailer and Trucker Sloth, and our gold members, Argo, Brendan Myers, Dallas Robbins, Emily O'Kelly, Heather Boney, James Johnson, Joel Brooks, Jose Jimenez, Mac Time, Benji Kong, Marcus O'Neill, RJ Kern, Dano, Skinny Matt, Mr. and Mrs. Nasty Boots, Foolish Fuji, and Xavier Reyes. Thank you all for all of your support.